Good. So let's look at the later work of Picasso. So Cubism, an art movement which really was consciously revolutionary of the whole Renaissance tradition. It didn't so much throw away, completely eliminate that tradition as deconstruct it. It's there, but it's there in ruins, or it's used against itself, like the way in martial arts you might use the energy of someone's punch to get them off balance or something like that. So you see modeling, but modeling is so fragmented that all the different cues of modeling add up to contradict each other and then create a sense of two-dimensionality, the flatness of the actual surface. And you see perspective, but there are multiple viewpoints, so it's so fragmented that perspective sort of dies in front of you. So in order to break down a tradition that had been so strong, I think they had to produce an art that was art about art. It became not just the practice of art, but talking about art and what art can be or should be. It's a sort of meta-artistic moment. Similar thing happens with Duchamp putting a urinal in an art gallery. That's a sort of meta-artistic moment, a sort of philosophical statement about what is art, or what could be art. But having developed the language of Cubism, which I'd like to say that process ends about 1914 with the First World War, as I mentioned, that's when Braque and Picasso are no longer closely collaborating. The war intervenes. Having developed the language of Cubism, there's no need to quite be so meta-artistic, so concerned with the language. So what happens after the war is that Picasso carries on in many of his works using the Cubist language, but doesn't really push it into new developments. And because the language is already formed, it's more a matter of using the existing language. So what happens? It becomes a bit sort of more playful. Somehow he doesn't need to worry about pushing it into some new territory. So there's a certain kind of playfulness about it. It's a language that already exists, and he's now wants to say other things in it. And maybe the subject matter, for instance, becomes more diverse instead of just a few still lives of objects that you'd find in a studio, which again, in subject matter terms, is again pushing art back to talk about art itself, or the place of making of art, a self-referentiality. So Cubism was an enormously influential style, so you can't imagine really most abstract art if there wasn't Cubism and its fragmentation of form. An artist like Mondrian takes on a sort of Cubist style and then pushes it further to abstraction. I can't imagine him getting to abstraction without Cubism. Various surrealist artists will also make use of things they've learned from Cubism, but to take it for very different purposes. So many different artists will be influenced by Cubism. It's sort of central to much that happens later in modern art. So we're seeing, I think, in works like this, The Dog and Cock 1921 by Picasso, it's a Cubist language, but there's a sort of playfulness about it. The dog sees a dead chicken on the table that's been left there by, the cooks put their cooking ingredients on the table ready to prepare the meal, and the dog is taking an interest in it. So we don't see any sort of playful little incident like that in Cubist works before 1914, do we? This is something a little new. We don't see dogs and chickens and so forth. But Picasso being Picasso, he's not satisfied just to go on using the resources that he's already produced, the Cubist style. He does that, but he also produces works in which he completely, or almost completely, abandons all the modernist investigations and discoveries that he's come up with. A return to an almost a neoclassical or realist style. So there's a sort of internal contradiction in his work, which some art historians have found difficult to come to terms with, perhaps, or an issue worth discussing. Maybe it's less of a problem for us now. We're living after postmodernism. We're used to artists who shift from one style to a completely different style, from one work to the next. Like the German artist Gerhard Richter, sometimes he will produce an abstract work, other times he'll produce a sort of photorealist work, and there's no problem, no one's worried about that. Or different styles within the same work, even in some pop artists like David Hockney, you find that. But it's not something everyone did, so it's worth looking at. So just little funny details here, like the dog's tongue is on the yellow area or whatever. The dog fits in to the space underneath the table. He's still thinking about the composition of forms, matching of forms, knitting forms together. It's not exactly that every work he's producing in this period is a collage, but because he made collage so many times, collage has influenced even the way he makes paintings. So everything is sort of knitted together as if it were little bits of coloured paper. Colour itself has come back as it did in collage. So the works we'll see from now on have abandoned largely that sort of grey, olive, ochre tonalities of the Cubist works, and it's much more rich in colour. But here's an example of what I'm talking about, one of his works that go back to more realist or neoclassical feel, The Mother and Child, 1921, or at least, there's a sort of volumetric quality. Cubism, with its fragmentation of form and its multiple viewpoints, broke down solidity of form. It didn't quite make transparency, but it produced that sense of fragmentation. Here, all that has gone. The volume is carefully, richly suggested by shading, going back to a traditional means. Even the subject matter is pretty traditional. Mother and child, woman conceived in her role as involved with children, very traditional or conservative conception of what a woman's life should be. It's a modern painting, like the very simplified treatment of the background, or the way actually the anatomy is distorted in something. It's not like a 19th century academic painter would treat the theme. It's not actually going back, but there's something funny going on here. So different ways to explain this. First thing to say is it's part of a broader tendency in the art of this period. I think in 1926, the French writer and artist Jean Cocteau used the phrase "return to order," rappel à l'ordre. So return to order is a kind of tendency of that time, back to something not so avant-garde. Possibly you could explain it as because of the First World War, a time of great disorder and disruption. Maybe after that, in the years after that, a lot of people wanted something a bit more ordered. That's one way of thinking about it. This is one of the earliest works by Picasso, which sort of prefigures this return to realism or the neoclassical. There's no one style, there are different styles. Of course, this is a drawing, so it's going to be different anyway. It's a drawing he made in 1915 of Vollard, Well, Vollard, the art dealer, we've already seen Picasso's representation of him from 1909, 1910, and this is radically different. It's almost like going back to the drawing style of Ingres, a sort of neoclassical drawing style. Wonderful, precise drawings of Ingres. So this is this is quite early, 1915. It's only a year after Cubist collages and, the end of that process. It's a little bit of a hint of it. Remember, we're already in the wartime years, 1915. 1914 to 1918 is the wartime years. So possibly it's a response to that new situation. This is 1917, Portrait of Olga in an Armchair, 1917. Olga is his wife, Famously, there are a variety of different women in Picasso's life at different times. Olga was a ballet dancer. She came from a different kind of social circle from those that he had been in before, instead of the more bohemian world. This is a slightly different, more socially elevated world. You can pick that out almost in her persona. First of all, she's coming across as more of a personality than some of the women in the earlier paintings. But certainly the style is different. So is this sort of more classical treatment related to a new social environment that he's moving in, new circle? Not just his wife, but his wife's circle, possibly, Consciously classical, this work, The Pipes of Pan, 1923. So in the subject matter, it looks back to classical mythology. You could find, I haven't done so, but you could find classical sculptures that you could liken this to. Picasso had made a trip to Rome and Naples in 1917 and studied classical antiquities there. So that's what art historians often take that as the starting point of that phase in his work, that sort of neoclassical reaction. Some of his very late Cubist works from just around 1914, they have a very decorative quality to them, almost like they're using a sort of pointillist dot decorative motif. And so maybe it's a kind of reaction against that, to get rid of the decorative, to go back to something like this. It's part of a larger theme that I've already mentioned with Picasso of painting after sculpture. This is an influence of classical sculpture, just as he was interested in African sculptural art, three-dimensional art. Or just as Cubism itself often seems like a breaking down, like a smashing down of form. It's all like an engagement with three-dimensional form, the way a sculptor could carve into a solid piece of wood or something. And just want to make this point, I already said, that it's a broader tendency. It's not just Picasso who's going back to more realistic or classical styles. So just to give you a few examples of that. And in fact, the slides, the comparative slides on the other side of your slide list are, for some reason I put these at the bottom. So this is Severini. These are not in the right order. Severini's the Blue Dancer. Severini's one of the main Italian futurist artists. So futurism is itself one of the movements inspired by Cubism, the discoveries of Picasso and Braque, because you have the fragmentation of form and the time dimension has been brought back into art. We've just been talking about that. So they use that to represent movement. So this is Severini. Just double check, yes, 1912. But then this is Severini in 1916. So similar to the Picasso subject matter of mother and child, socially conservative as well as artistically conservative. Pretty different, right? And how about this? This is Carlo Carra, again, Italian futurist artist. So the free word painting or the patriotic celebration, it comes under more than one title. And then this. So this is between 1914 and 1926. I'm taking quite a bigger time gap between the two. But maybe he's looking back, one would think, at maybe early Italian, the so-called Italian primitives, the early Renaissance artists, something like that. It's hard to imagine without modernism, but at the same time it's taking steps back from that fragmentation. Another movement of this time that is very tied up with how we deal with the post-war situation is purism. So this is a work by Ozenfant. The two main people associated with purism are Ozenfant and Généré. Généré is better known as Le Corbusier, the architect, but he started off more as a painter and then really going into architecture. One of the most important architects of the 20th century. So this is Ozenfant's flask, guitar, glass and bottle on a green table. You can see things about it that are called neoclassical, like the way the design of the bottle almost looks like the fluting of a Doric column or something like that, classical column. This is a little bit of a different reaction to that of artists who go back straightforwardly to realism or neoclassical style. The subject matter and something of the treatment remind us of Cubism, but yet there is this sort of simplification and, I suppose you want to say, a sort of classical feel. So they're consciously engaging themselves or positioning themselves as being within the legacy of Cubism, but trying to take it to the next step as they see it. They read the philosophy of Plato or whatever. They got the idea of simple Platonic forms behind the multiplicity of appearances, or they've heard about Darwinian theories of natural selection, how forms are fitted to function by the harsh processes of reality, or they think that maybe the same thing happens with man-made forms, that over time they evolve to become suited to their function. And they think a similar thing should be happening in art. They're looking a lot to mathematics. They want some kind of increased sense of order. They liked something that they saw in Cubism, but they want to make it a little bit less visually chaotic to their way of thinking. This is the sort of thing they would say, that there is no art worth having without the excitement of an intellectual order, of a mathematical order. Cubism foresaw the advantages of choosing selected objects, but by an error. Instead of sifting out the general laws of these objects, Cubism only showed their accidental aspects. So this is quite a powerful tendency within French art, this kind of a sort of neoclassical modern represented by purism, And that's one strong tendency in post-war French art. Another tendency is surrealism, which is consciously very opposed to all that, consciously revolutionary. So those are perhaps the two main things going on in Parisian art in those years. And Picasso, you could say, is somewhere between the two. He's been courted by the two camps. The surrealists would love him to sign him up, the most famous artists will sign him up to what they're doing, get him to somehow ratify them, and the purists, of course, would like the same thing. And Picasso does sort of move a little bit towards purism at certain times. There's a gallery associated with those more tendencies, and then at other times more towards surrealism, sailing between the two, if you like. So back to Picasso. This is the three musicians, but actually there are two versions of it. This is the version in the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and then there's a version a little bit later in Philadelphia. This one. Again, you have a feeling of a sort of collage feel. The way the shapes are cut, it's hard to imagine it without collage. And even the theme of music, which was so much there in their Cubist still lives. Little bit of differences between the two versions. The dog under the table is only in the MoMA version. And the musicians, performers change places if you pay attention. The Pierrot figure is in the middle here. But over to one side here. They're masked figures. Standing out towards us. Very frontal poses. More colour, more sort of, I have to say, sort of playful feel about it. Lighter tone. Little kind of visual puns, jokes like this, the three holes in the clarinet or whatever it is. Starts to look like a human face. Eyes and mouth. Sort of syncopated rhythm of the composition, almost mimicking the feel of the music itself, giving you a sort of visual counterpart to music, maybe. That's one way of looking at it. Well, still life, the subject of so much Cubist art is still there. But we never saw anything like this in terms of the colour of it or this rich sort of decorative area. Has he been looking at Matisse? I think he certainly has. He all the way through, Braque was such an important collaborator with him in those intense Cubist years. But there's a broader pattern in Picasso's life of thinking of Matisse as the one competitor that he has to keep an eye on, wants to know what Matisse is doing. And over the longer run, maybe Matisse becomes a more important point of reference. And there are ways you can see in their work how they've been aware of each other's art. There have been a couple of, one book and then later another exhibition on Matisse and Picasso where which has a catalogue, so a second book, which tells the story of their interaction. Well, those were the three musicians, and this is the three dancers, 1925, just a little bit later. And I think this is a work where we see maybe the three musicians, it still has a sort of purist quality to it. But the three dancers, maybe we could say, has more of a surrealist quality to it. Surrealism, an art that wants to make us unsettled in our relationship to our everyday mind, our everyday life, wants to shock us out of our sense of normality by infusing the unconscious into life, or creating a sense of the marvelous, infusing waking life with dreams, say. Sometimes misunderstood as being artists who want us to go off into the realm of fantasy. No, they want us to stay in the real world, but have a greater sense of the marvelousness of it. Picasso is never really a surrealist, but he sort of dabbles a little bit with art. That they were interested in dream with. He's always an artist with his eyes open, looking out into the world. He's not an artist who wants to stay with the imagination, but he feeds a little bit from it. The most important figure in surrealism is the poet André Breton, Breton, and Breton met Picasso in 1923. He admired Picasso. Picasso exhibits with the surrealists 1925, the year of this painting. Perhaps of the surrealist painters, the one he's probably closest to is his fellow Spaniard Miro, Juan Miro. He knew Miro from 1919, I think, when Miro had also been from Barcelona, where Picasso had been based. Miro is one of the more painterly of the surrealists. So there's more room for dialogue. Certainly Miro takes things from Picasso's style, but maybe a little bit the other way around, arguably. Picasso brought a still life from Miro. Surrealism, I think, helps add a kind of emotional depth to his work that wasn't always there before, or kind of a slight kind of raw quality coming in. One thing that one can say here is surrealist is the sort of the treatment of bodily features here. In Miro's painting, you'll see eyes being displaced to become breast symbols or vagina symbols. We're getting a little bit of that here, I feel, like this eye-like breast form here. Visual punning between facial and bodily features. It's certainly, I think, some distance away from the coolness of his earlier Cubist work. The mood is different. And one thing about that is not just surrealism, it's, I think, looking back at this work, the Demoiselle d'Avignon. I mentioned before that, in order to, it was a resource for creating Cubism, but actually to create Cubism, he had to give up some of the things that were in Demoiselle d'Avignon as well in order to move forward. There was too many, maybe inconsistent things within it. But that means it was something rich that he could go back to. It's still in his studio in the 1920s. It was reproduced for the very first time in a surrealist publication of 1925, the same year as the Three Dancers, La Révolution Surréaliste. So, he's seeing, well, maybe I was a bit of a surrealist already. I have this sort of more raw or sense of violent emotion there in the Demoiselle d'Avignon. Maybe something of that is coming back, especially this figure here. I would tend to read it as a work with disparity, that this figure here seems quite calm, poised. But this figure here seems sort of in ecstatic abandon, lost in the dance. Maybe like a sort of a dance where you work yourself into a trance through dancing, Dionysian, or some kind of primitive tribal dance. That's the sort of image that's evoked. It's a kind of oddly, there's this disparity between the two figures, poise and abandon maybe, but there's also a disparity between the dancers and their setting. The setting, well, there's wallpaper and French windows. It's a very domestic, ordinary sort of bourgeois domestic setting, if you like. Yet there's this sort of primitive kind of dance going on that you wouldn't expect to see, not really sort of appropriate for such a setting. It's not ballet dance, I think. It's not something classical dance. It's some kind of more primitive in its association, the kind of dance being shown. There's quite a rough paint surface, which you can actually even see in the projection here. What is that? That's evidence that he was reworking. This, I think, is the part of the painting that was finished last. This figure is different from the other figures, and this part of the painting has this evidence of reworking. Well, I've said it before that Picasso is a very self-confident artist, so when there's reworking, serious reworking going on, that's a sign of something new happening, Three female figures, very clear that they're female, yet there's this sort of black figure here. This seems to be the head, yet there's also a head here. How do we make sense of that? Then maybe we say, oh, it could be like the way a figure is wearing a mask, something like that. It's a kind of dance where figures wear masks, like those African dancers who wore those masks that he was so interested in. At one point he talks about it as a sort of male presence, and he, the work where the main figures are female, and he relates it to a friend of his who just died called Pichot, P-I-C-H-O-T, Pichot. Died through suicide. It's one of the traumas in Picasso's life. Pichot had married the same woman who had been the lover of Casagemas, his friend who committed suicide early on. So she's not a very good luck, I think it seems. So anyway, there's some sort of personal dimension, and it was not something that could be, the viewer can pick out of the painting. It's not something the painting tells us. It's just some personal association which we only know about because Picasso gave some hint at some point. There's also another sort of hidden hovering presence here on the left-hand side. The blue. The blue is simultaneously the sky, of course, seen through the painting, through the window of the painting, but it's also here doubles to be a profile face hovering like this one over the work. I don't know, one can speculate. Sometimes in these sort of shamanic dance rituals, you're invoking the presence or power of a god or something like that, or some kind of supernatural figure to come for a healing ceremony or whatever it happens to be. This is just speculation, of course, but that's one way to deal with thinking about these extra presences coming in. Even with this figure, it's almost like there are doublings of faces. You're looking at two eyes here. This is a face seen from the front, but here, look, there's like a face from the side, a little profile face, a sort of moon face, crescent moon face, you want to say. Some other associations. Well, where are the breasts? Is this one breast and that's another breast? And then this is an arm. But then this has a kind of breast-like quality. Oh, it looks like the sky seen under her arm. But then we know from this that sky is not necessarily just sky. It could be sky could be a face. So sky could be a breast. Certainly, what's this here? This kind of maybe looks like a nipple. Are these the breasts? Maybe that's just a shadow. It's all a bit unclear. But then this is a figure in motion. It's hard to pick out what is what. Does this hurt? Maybe her head is moving around. Fingers. What are these? Well, again, it could be shadow. If I'm saying that's shadow, that could be shadow. Picking out these forms, but it looks almost like nails. So it's been noted that this figure with its arms stretched out is a little bit like a sort of figure of a crucified Christ. Common iconography in Western art. Those being the nails. He does do a crucifixion around this time in 1930. There's a drawn version in 1929. So we know, that's a theme that interests him. He also has a renewed interest in primitive art during this time. Possibly that figure on the left-hand side could be related to this kind of figure. I can't find exactly the image that I want, but with these Alaskan masks, dance masks, sometimes you get things hanging off the main thing, hinged additions to the face of the main mask. And one could possibly relate this to the way that this head is treated here. If so, this would be something coming via Surrealism. Surrealists were very interested in Alaskan art. I'm going to try for the only time in this course to use this visualizer, because I just managed to print out. Let's see. Yeah. This is the Surrealist map of the world. They change the size of countries based on how important they think those countries are. So the Surrealists were very interested in tribal arts, but not in African arts. They didn't like that at all, really. So that's reflected here by how small Africa is on their map. Whereas Alaska, where that mask I showed you came from, that's bigger than Africa and bigger than China as well. And they really liked Alaska, so it would not be beyond the bounds of possibility that Picasso has somehow picked up that interest. They like Pacific art, like the Easter Island. They like, the Easter Island is pretty big too, as big as India. Anyway, so Alaskan and Pacific Island art is probably what interests them the most. Oh, yeah, the Indonesian archipelago too. I've got one other possible influence to sort of bring to bear on this work. I've actually never noticed this mentioned in the literature of Picasso, but it seems a very obvious one to me. And that's something from the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which, despite its title, is a book written by Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was lesbian, and Alice B. Toklas was her lover. So at one point she wrote her own autobiography as if it was the autobiography of her lover. and sort of see herself through another person's eyes, a sort of distancing strategy. And at one point in that autobiography, she tells a story of a party. You know, she was always having salons where she invites artists and cultural figures around to her home. So this is a description of one such party. Picasso is there, and Braque is there. Henri Rousseau was there. Someone got very drunk and began fighting, and they had to take him in another room. Braque is this very big bloke. You know, he grabbed hold of some of the sculptures to protect them while the guy was going mad, and Picasso helped lock him in a room to calm down. Thereafter the evening was peaceful. Marie Laurencin sang in a thin voice some charming old Norman songs. The wife of Aguero sang some charming old Limousin songs. Pichot, that's the friend of Picasso who died, committed suicide. Pichot danced a wonderful religious Spanish dance, ending in making of himself a crucified Christ upon the floor. Well, yeah, I mentioned the crucifixion allusion and the oddness of having a kind of a dance like that in a domestic setting, you know. Guillaume Apollinaire solemnly approached myself and my friend means Gertrude Stein, and asked us to sing some of the native songs of the Red Indians. They were Americans, you see. So they're asked to, you know, come up with American native people's songs. We did not either of us feel up to that, to the great regret of Guillaume and all the company. So, you know, the idea of you're in a domestic setting in Paris, and then someone would sing the songs of a Native American people, that sort of brings us back to the potential Alaskan reference here. Anyway, this is a sort of strange conjunction of the tribal and the bourgeois domestic interior, which I think you do have here. So to me, this seems a possible link. Okay, let's take our break there. I've kept you a little late to finish talking about this work.